Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar, your host. And today I'm going to talk to you about Hamas, the organization which has triggered this incredible war that is taking place in the Holy Land. The casualties, the brutality, the violence, the huge atrocities that we are witnessing are just unbelievable that in this day and age that we are witnessing literally as if it's happening in our own living rooms, on television, on YouTube, on social media. The intense, shall we say, violence against human life. And in the process, I want to make two things clear as to what Hamas is, and the fact, most importantly, is that it has nothing to do with Islam, really. I've said this in the past. I've said this in many articles in the context of Al Qaeda, in the context of Hamas and other organizations like this, like ISIS, that these organizations have used whatever in Islamic sources that they can use to interpret in a way to justify their brutality, their really horrible actions that they commit in the name of religion or for political purposes. And it is important for Muslim voices to speak up and at least go on record, whether people believe you or whether accept your arguments or not, to go on record and say that this is un-Islamic and the reasons for those for that argument. So before I go ahead and list five reasons why I think Hamas is not an Islamic government. It is indeed a terrorist organization. There is no doubt about it. I want you to please, if you are here for the first time, to subscribe to Khanversations. Make sure you like this video. Ring the bell icon so you get future notifications. This is my 7th update on the Arab-Israeli conflict, on the basically Israel-Hamas conflict. For those of you who follow Khanversations regularly, you can support Khanversations by joining and becoming a member. So please press the join button, which is right next to the subscribe button, if you want to support Khanversations. A few things that I want to clarify about Hamas is that even though it has, for historical reasons, we have to go back to the elections of 2006 and the violence in 2005 to understand how Hamas has come to basically control Gaza. But its control of Gaza does not make it a government. That is one thing that I want to make it clear. It is an organization that has a singular purpose. It seems to be focused on ending Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. And unfortunately, all the means of resistance that Hamas has employed, for which it has got any attention, is violent and often targeted at civilians. And so terrorism has been its main instrument in its war against Israel. And even though its charter says that its goal is to destroy Israel, its spiritual leader, who was killed by Israel, Sheikh Yassin, had said very clearly that the goal of Hamas is to go back to the 1967 borders. He had said something to this effect, that he was responsible only for the land that they had lost during his generation, and that was land that was lost in 1967. So in a sense, Sheikh Yassin had signaled that all Hamas wanted to do was to go back to the 1967 borders. That is also the position of the United Nations, and that is the starting point of any dialogue about the two-state solution. But it continues to obviously maintain in its charter that its goal is to destroy Israel. And has refused to remove it, and that has been one of the reasons why it has always been excluded in any dialogue about the future of Palestine. In this brief discussion, what I want to reiterate is what I've already said in many articles and in books in the past 20 years, that political Islam, there are two versions of political Islam: the violent version, like ISIS, Al Qaeda, and Hamas, and then there is the so-called peaceful and democratic version with Jamaat-e-Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood. In many ways, all the violent versions are un-Islamic in their nature. There have been many fatwas issued by many scholars. All you have to do is Google fatwa against ISIS, fatwa against Al-Qaeda, etc., and you will see books and thousands of articles explaining why the actions of these so-called terrorist organizations have nothing to do with Islamic teachings. But the so-called moderate organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat Islami and others, often in their interpretation of Islamic law, choose the hardest and often the harshest form of interpretation that is available that can be advanced. There are many ways in which you can look at Islamic sources. There are so many sources besides the Quran, opinions of scholars, traditions, hadiths, authentic hadiths, inauthentic hadiths, etc. So there are many of these sources, and you can pick and choose whatever you want to fit your original political and moral agenda. And so what they have done essentially is given Islam in this era that we live in a characteristic which is often defined as undemocratic. They ignore sources that do not allow violence, that forbid violence explicitly, and try to find alternative sources which will justify their use of violence and their use of harshness in the way they govern. Just look at Taliban and the manner in which they are ruling in Afghanistan, and look at other Muslim countries. They are so different from the Taliban. So it tells you that, yes, there are many, many different ways in which Islam can be interpreted. And one more thing about Hamas does not represent all of the Palestinians, and it does not, I think, also represent all of Gazans. When was the last time Gazans have voted for Hamas? That was in 2005. It is nearly 18 years ago. There have been no elections, nothing since then. So we have to keep in mind that Hamas does not represent Palestine. It does not represent the Muslim world. It certainly does not represent Islam. So keeping that in mind, let's look at the 5 reasons why I think Hamas is not an Islamic government and is essentially a terrorist organization. It may have a just cause, and clearly it does. Palestinians have a right to a state as much as Israel has a right to a state. Israelis have a right to a state. The Palestinians have a right to defend themselves as much as Israelis have a right to defend themselves. But it depends on how you do these things. That is the critical aspect. It's not that Palestinians do not have the right to freedom, to democracy, to a government, to a state of their own, a state which has constitutional independence. They have all those rights. It's how they struggle for those rights which are very critical. And it is in that context that my critique of Hamas should be seen. My critique of Hamas is not a critique of Palestinians, not a critique of Gazans, unlike some of the commentators in the West who seem to not make any distinction. At least Israeli army, Israeli bombs, and American supply of weapons to Israel doesn't seem to distinguish between Hamas and Gazans, but I do. So number one reason is very simple. You've heard this 1,000 times. I'm going to repeat it again. In the 32nd verse of the Quran, chapter 5, the Quran very clearly says that killing one single person is like killing one innocent person is like killing all of humanity, and saving one person is like saving all of humanity. This is a verse which is actually issued in the context of the Jewish community, and also reminds us in the Quran that this was also a message sent to Jews, that killing one innocent person is like killing all of humanity. So if you know fully well that when you bomb this hospital, when you bomb this school, when you bomb this building, which later you will claim that Hamas was hiding in there, but if you know for sure that you're going to kill some innocent people, remember that even the Torah says that it is like killing all of humanity. And the same is true for Muslims too. If you know that your particular violent act is going to kill innocent people, then know that you're killing all of humanity. It is that horrible. It is genocidal. Killing innocent people, according to Jewish and Muslim scripture, is genocidal. And therefore, targeting and killing civilians and innocent people who have nothing to do with what is at stake is essentially an un-Islamic act. And so what Hamas did 2 weeks ago when it attacked and killed innocent people, many of them who are not even Israelis, who are foreigners, uh, uh, then that is an un-Islamic act. That's my first point, that the Quran forbids killing of innocent people and equates it to genocide. Interestingly, I also want to share one hadith. There are many, many hadiths which put restrictions on how warfare has to be conducted, which articulate the ethics of warfare, not targeting old people, not targeting environment, trees, waters, sources of water, children, women, etc. There are tons and tons of them. Just pick any book on ethics, Islamic ethics of warfare. There are many, and you will find them. There's one excellent one by Professor Khalid Abul Fadl of UCLA. So the second point is I want to identify one hadith, which is also number 32, like the 32nd ayah of the Quran, chapter 5. This is hadith number 32 in the Nawawi collection of 40 hadiths. It's actually 42 hadiths, but it's called Al-Nawawi's 40 hadith collection. I will be sharing the links to both the verse of the Quran and the hadith in my video description, so you can go and look for itself. The hadith basically says, La darar wa la dirar. It says, do no harm, do not respond to harm. I mean, to me, it was mind-boggling when I read it first time many, many years ago, that the Prophet forbid Muslims from doing harm and forbid Muslims from even responding to harm. Leave it in the hands of God. Let God be the judge. That is very, very difficult, especially in the context of national security, etc. It's impossible for countries to not respond to threats or harm, but to not initiate harm, that's not very difficult. There are many countries in the world, many communities in the world who do not initiate harm. And so that is something that further tells me that the actions that Hamas chose is devoid of Islamic ethics. I wonder why people don't remind groups like Hamas and other extremist organizations, a lot of them these days in the Muslim world, about these values. Why don't imams repeat this day and night in their khutbahs and their sermons, that the Prophet forbid Muslims from doing harm and even from responding to harm? So that is the basic Quran and Hadith combination, which tells me very clearly that the actions that Hamas is taking are un-Islamic. The third point is a bit more sophisticated and complicated to understand. It is that Hamas is essentially a national liberation organization which is using terrorism as its means, as its preferred means, you could say. So Islamic principles and ethics prefer universal identity and universalism versus national or tribal parochialism. So in that sense, when even if you're making policies in the interest of national interest, because Islamic principles and values are universal in nature, they apply to everybody, everywhere. Whether you accept it or not is a different question. I live in the United States. I don't drink alcohol. I don't eat pork. These are Islamic values and teachings, and they are applicable to me in the United States as they were applicable to me when I was in India or last week when I was in Italy. So Islamic principles and Islamic scope of ethics is universal, and therefore it will always trump national considerations. And so Hamas using its identity as an Islamic movement, as an Islamic organization, cannot justify whatever choice of means it does, which are against universal principles, and plead that it is doing so in the name of freedom and struggle and independence. It cannot do both. It can be a Palestinian liberation organization that uses terrorism is fine. That we could say is okay, that's what the Palestinians, that these group of Palestinians are doing, but that can't also be an Islamic organization. You can't say you're Islamic and then not adhere to Islamic rules and principles and values. Number 4, now this is something that is much broader and goes beyond the very concept of nation-state system, is the principle of migration. There is a verse in the Quran the 97th verse in chapter 4. And according to these, angels will ask people in what condition they lived. And the people who lived under oppression said, "We were oppressed in the land." And the angels would then ask them, "Was not the earth of Allah spacious enough for you to emigrate from there?" So the point that this verse is making is that if you experience oppression in some place, migrate. That is the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad. He migrated from Mecca to Medina because he was being oppressed, his people were being oppressed, and he went away. So the question for Palestinians in Gaza, even today, is the same, that the Quran permits you and even perhaps prefers that you migrate rather than stay and experience oppression. The reason for staying and experiencing oppression is the pursuit of the Palestinian state, the idea of a Palestinian state. Yes, you could make the arguments that no one has the right to take you away from your homeland, take you away from your homes and destroy, and all of that is fine. But I don't think nationalistic aspirations can be justified using Islamic theology, because, as I just cited a verse in the Quran which says that you can migrate. So if Hamas is going to prevent Palestinians, or for that matter, if Egypt is going to prevent Gazans from migrating away from war, then it is violating Islamic ethics and principles. Finally, I want to reflect upon the choices that Hamas has made, both in its governance of Gaza and its assault on Israel. What it accomplished was really unbelievable, unexpected, that it was able to launch an attack on Israel, which has such celebrated infrastructure of intelligence gathering, so much support from the West, from the United States, the CIA, etc. There's real-time sharing of intelligence and data, yet Hamas was able to get around it and launch an attack on Israel. But during the attack, if it had chosen to follow Islamic principles, avoid killing children, avoid killing women, avoid killing old people, and if it was even seen as deliberately targeting only military installations and security forces and avoiding killing civilians, it would have won a major moral victory and perhaps even the support of the public opinion worldwide. But its brutality that it manifests revealed its own character. The manner in which it has killed some innocent people clearly shows, in fact, the numbers are in hundreds, shows its character. And that is, to me, mind-boggling, because if its sole purpose was to provoke Israel to come and kill a lot of Palestinians so that the Abrahamic Accords come under pressure and public get angry with Israel, then it has failed, at least until now. 10 days of incessant daily bombing. I see no pressure from the rest of the world on Israel to stop. So it is, perhaps it will have to wait for a month of extremely brutal campaign, which cuts off water supply, health, medicine, light, power, and generally creates havoc with civilian life in Gaza before what Hamas desires begins to happen. So the fact that it chose to target civilians against Islamic teachings during its assault, but also during its governance in the last 15, 16 years in Gaza, it could have created a model state, corruption-free, a state which had periodic elections. Imagine if Gaza had elections for every 5 years to pick a government or a head of state. It would have once again sent a different message to the world and to people, and even to Gazans. Their life would definitely have been better. I guarantee you, if Hamas had an election in 2010 or 2012 in the territory that it controlled, Gaza, provided freedom of speech, provided all kinds of freedoms to the people, it would have won the hearts and minds of the rest of the world, even in the West, because Israel has increasingly become an apartheid state in its desperation to control and realize its biblical and religious ambitions of expanding Israel to the biblical proportions that it thinks it should be, depriving Palestinians in the West Bank of any rights, creating two-tier systems, one for Israelis, one for Palestinians. So yes, it would have been a huge contrast, but all Hamas did was oppress its own people and supposedly providing a form of Islamic governance which is completely un-Islamic. The goal of an Islamic government is to provide hayatul tayyiba, the good life, where people have material benefits, material joys, and also an opportunity to grow spiritually. I don't see any of that in Gaza. It's a place which is suffering. It is a symbol of human suffering. And its own government often brings upon it more suffering. So I don't know what is going to happen in the next few months, whether Israel will successfully ethnically cleanse Gaza and push the Gazans out of Gaza into Egypt, whether it will kill thousands and thousands more. Already, I think the death toll has gone up into thousands, many of them children. And what will happen of Hamas, I don't know. The leaders who made this decision to do what they did, what will happen of them, we will know soon. But I must tell you this much, and this is the sole purpose of this conversation, is that under no circumstances does Hamas represent Islamic values, Islamic governance, or Islamic principles. And therefore, those Muslims who are watching should not fall under the delusion that even they support Hamas, they are supporting some kind of an Islamic agenda. The agenda has nothing to do with Islam. It's an agenda of Palestinian nationalism. It could have been achieved in a different way, and they chose violence as their main means, and therefore they are experiencing and suffering from violence. But having said that aside, putting aside what is Islamic, I think the rest of the world, which does not believe in Islam, or in those Muslim countries who do, they must ask themselves this question, that while we are putting all the blame for all the misery on Hamas, what about the responsibility of the so-called civilized world to Palestinians who have been living under occupation for nearly 6 decades, since 1967, 33 plus 23. 56 years under military occupation, which is getting brutal and brutal every day. Forget about what is happening in Gaza. In this year alone, in 2023, in West Bank, you have seen more deaths of Palestinians by settlers and the Israeli army than in many years in the past. Their lands are being confiscated, settlements are being built. The hope of a viable Palestinian state is being killed every day. What is the responsibility of the so-called civilized world, which looks down on Hamas and Palestinians as morally inferior people? So what are these morally superior people doing about this profound injustice that is ongoing every day in the world that we live in? This is Muqtedar Khan. Please, if you have not subscribed to Khanversations, until now, do subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, share it with your friends and your social network. And until next time, I'm your host, Muqtedar Khan. Take care.